Romania was not born in a single year or through a single victory. It was shaped over centuries on a frontier where empires would one day meet, collide, and leave their mark. But before empire, before conquest, before even memory in the written sense, there was the land. There were mountains curving like a spine through the middle of the country. There were forests thick enough to conceal movement and rivers wide enough to divide worlds. There was the Danube, immense and watchful, and the Black Sea, opening the region to trade, migration, and danger. Long before anyone called this place Romania, it was already a crossroads between Central Europe, the Balkans, the steppe, and the Black Sea basin. Geographies made these lands fertile, strategic, and exposed all at once. This is where the story begins. Not with a crown, not with a flag, not with a state. It begins with terrain, because terrain decides too much. It determines where people move, where they settle, what they defend, what they fear, and what kinds of worlds they can build. In the lands that would one day become Romania, geography was never background. It was destiny. And so, the first episode of this story is not about a nation yet. It is about the ancient human worlds that came before the nation. The first settlers, the first villages, the first painted pottery, the first peoples whose names rise out of the silence of prehistory. It is about a place that would later become one of Europe's great fault lines. And before the land had a single name, it already held the first chapters of history. Look at this landscape closely enough, and the later history almost begins to explain itself. The Carpathians are not only beautiful, they are a system of barriers, refuges, corridors, and vantage points. They shelter valleys, fracture movement, and shape patterns of settlement. The Danube is not only a river, it is a route, a border, a resource, and, in later centuries, a military line of enormous consequence. The plains invite movement. The hills offer defense. The Black Sea coast connects inland worlds to wider networks of exchange. Taken together, these lands are not remote. They are connected in every direction, which is precisely why they would be contested again and again. But before they were contested, they were inhabited. The earliest chapters of that habitation come to us in fragments. Bone, stone, ash. The traces are often incomplete, but what they reveal is immense. In southwestern Romania, in a cave called a cave with bones, archaeologists uncovered remains belonging to one of the earliest modern humans known in Europe. Genetic work dated an Oase individual to roughly 41,500 to 39,500 years old. Years ago, that matters because it changes the emotional scale of the story. The history of Romania is often told through kingdoms, wars, revolutions, dictatorships, and borders. But the human story here begins far earlier than any of that. It begins in darkness, in glacial Europe, in a world of raw survival, where modern humans were still spreading across the continent. Before Dacia, before Rome, before any medieval principality, people were already moving through these lands. They breathed this air. They crossed these ridges. They looked out over river valleys that still exist today. And yet presence is not the same as settlement. For thousands of years, human life in these landscapes was mobile, adaptive, and precarious. Survival meant reading seasons, terrain, animal movement, and climate with precision. Romania, in the deepest sense, is not a young story. The state may be modern. The human presence is not. Because if later empires believed they were entering empty land, they were wrong. Long before recorded power arrived, the land had already been known, crossed, endured, and remembered by human beings. This is how the story begins, with a silence so old it predates history, and with the first scattered evidence that the silence was never empty at all. The next great transformation did not arrive in armor. It arrived in seed. The relationship between people and land began to change. Groups who had once moved more fluidly through the environment started to remain in place longer. The region that now forms Romania became part of the wider Neolithic transformation that reshaped life across Europe. Farming, animal domestication, pottery, and more stable settlement patterns took hold. People no longer only passed through the landscape. Increasingly, they organized themselves within it. That shift may sound quiet compared with the drama of kings and empires, but it was one of the greatest revolutions in human history. To settle means more than to stop moving. It means to begin building repetition into life. A hearth is used again. A field is planted again. A path becomes familiar. A grave anchors memory to one place. A house teaches the next generation that home can exist somewhere specific, somewhere worth returning to, somewhere that can outlast the season. Once people began to stay, time itself changed shape. The cycle of movement gave way, at least in part, to the cycle of cultivation, sowing and harvest, storage and scarcity, animal care and seasonal return created new forms of discipline and dependence. The land became more than a setting. It became an investment. Labor was sunk into it. Hope was tied to it. Communities became legible in new ways because permanence leaves patterns. Villages, unlike passing camps, revealed choices. They show how people shared work, distributed space, structured daily life, and imagined continuity. And continuity is the key word here. The first settled communities in these lands were not Romanian in any modern sense. They were not nations. They were not states, but they began the long process by which people transformed territory into lived world. They established habits of dwelling, agriculture, storage, craft, and burial. They did the oldest work behind every later civilization. They made life hold that meant working the soil, keeping animals, shaping tools, raising children inside routines, and attaching meaning to place. A field was not just food, it was security. A home was not just shelter, it really defined who you would become. A burial site was not just the disposal of the dead, it was a declaration that memory belonged here. This is the point where the history of the land begins to feel less like prehistoric survival and more like social life. The first villagers of these lands may have had no idea what would one day emerge here. But they began something all of those later worlds would inherit: the human act of turning land into continuity, not through fanfare, through repetition, through work, through staying. And then, out of the deep prehistoric world, beauty begins to speak. Across parts of what is now Romania and Moldova, one of Europe's most visually striking prehistoric cultures flourished in the 5th millennium BC, the Cucuteni Trypillia. Its pottery remains extraordinary even now. Red and orange surfaces, curving painted designs, spirals that suggest rhythm, motion, recurrence, perhaps even cosmology. These were not the products of a world without sophistication. They were the work of communities with discipline, aesthetic order, and a powerful visual language. Their settlements could be substantial. Their houses were often long and rectangular. In some cases, settlement layouts formed concentric rings, with organized interior space and enclosed central areas. These were not cities in the later classical sense, but they were planned communities, structured ones, communities that understood space, pattern, labor, and repetition. Trypillia culture extended into modern-day Romania and Moldova. Rectangular houses, sometimes arranged in concentric circles. Too often, the ancient past is flattened into something vague and dim. But the Cucuteni Trypillia world was not dim. It was vivid. It made things. It arranged things. It left behind evidence not only of subsistence, but of taste. These communities also cared about form, pattern, symbol, perhaps ritual, perhaps identity expressed through objects made to endure. These are not anonymous primitives stumbling through an unfinished world. These are makers, people who knew how to shape clay with confidence, people who built settlements, used recurring designs, and worked within recognizable traditions, people with shared habits and meanings, even if the exact content of those meanings remains partly out of reach, and yet the fragility remains. These cultures did not become a single uninterrupted civilizational line. Settlements shifted, landscapes changed, populations moved, continuity existed, but never in a simple straight line. The first episode is not trying to prove that Romania already existed in prehistory. It is doing something subtler and stronger. It is showing that the land later called Romania had already hosted complex, artistic, and organized human life on a significant scale. This was not empty land waiting for history to begin. History had already begun. It simply had not yet learned to write its own name. Then the rhythm hardens. The older village worlds do not disappear overnight, but a new logic begins to spread through them. Metal changes what people can make, how they can fight, how wealth can be stored, how status can be shown, and how far exchange can reach. Bronze is not just a material, it is a social accelerator. In the lands of present-day Romania, the Bronze Age leaves behind evidence not only of craft, but of scale. Some of the late Bronze Age hoards found here are among the largest known in Europe, signaling extensive metalworking, accumulation, and networks of value. Some late Bronze Age hoards from Romania contained up to 4 tons of bronze objects, and once wealth can be accumulated, displayed, and buried, society changes. Hierarchy sharpens, prestige becomes more visible, conflict becomes more structured. This is where the episode begins to move from deep prehistory toward the threshold of history. Over many centuries, through migration, intermingling, and adaptation, the population profile of the region continued to change. The Carpathian Danube region has been settled around 2000 BCE by Indo-Europeans who intermingled with native Neolithic populations to form the Thracians. The Thracians were not a single, tightly unified nation in the modern sense. They were a broad family of related peoples spread across much of southeastern Europe. But their emergence matters profoundly for this story, because from within that broader Thracian world would come the peoples later known as the Geti and the Dacia. The ancient world is still distant, but it is no longer anonymous. We can start to see the formation of peoples shaped by warfare, horsemanship, metalworking, exchange, and belief. We can start to imagine local elites, warrior cultures, and zones of influence spreading across river valleys, hills, and plains. The silence of prehistory is thinning. Soon, outside observers will begin to notice these lands not merely as terrain, but as the home of named peoples. It is still ancient, still partly obscure, still resistant to certainty, but it is nearing the threshold where power, identity, and memory begin to take forms recognizable in written history. And when that happens, everything accelerates. Because once peoples are named, they can be fought, traded with, feared, and eventually conquered. Visibility is dangerous, but it is also the beginning of historical presence. Metal had altered the scale of power. New peoples had emerged from older layers of life, and history was beginning to turn its gaze northward. Now the silence breaks. By the 6th century BC, classical sources begin to mention people on the lower Danube and nearby plains, the Geti. They were of Thracian origin. They were known as mounted archers, and with them the ancient lands we are tracing become more fully visible in the historical record. The Geti were ancient Thracian people inhabiting the lower Danube region, first appearing in the 6th century BC. They are known for mounted archery and devotion to Zal. The Geti existed in a world of contact and pressure. They were influenced by Scythian currents. They were known to Greeks. They came into the orbit of Macedonian power. Philip II's dynasty touched their world, and Alexander's forces crossed the Danube and struck a Getic center. These lands were no longer outside history's field of vision. They were part of a frontier where major powers were already probing, testing, and reacting. And yet, one of the most important truths here is uncertainty. The relationship between the Geti and the Dacians is still debated in detail, and ancient naming was not always neat. Britannica describes them as closely related and notes that some historians have suggested they may have been one. People known by different names in different contexts. That ambiguity is not a problem to be solved. It is part of the reality of the ancient world. Modern viewers often want clean labels. Ancient history rarely provides them. What we can say with confidence is that by the last centuries before Christ, a Ghetto-Dacia world had emerged in and around the Carpathian Danube region. In the 1st century BC, a ruler named Berbista would gather these related worlds into a powerful political formation around 60 to 50 BC under him. The Geti and Dacians moved from scattered strength toward large-scale consolidation. For thousands of years, the land had been inhabited, crossed, settled, cultivated, shaped, and remembered. Human beings had built villages here, painted spirals here, buried bronze here, named gods here, and defended themselves here. Layer by layer, the foundations of a larger ancient world had formed. Now, for the first time, that world was about to gather itself into power. The land had prepared the people had prepared the kingdom, and history was about to accelerate. Next time, Dacia.